Today's lesson is about kinetic energy. The Do Now activity is asking you to state the law of conservation of energy. Pause the video and have a go. If you need to, look back at last lesson's notes. On the next slide, you can self-assess with green and red pen your answer. Progress indicators for the lesson on kinetic energy. For good progress, you need to recall and apply the equation kinetic energy equals 1/2 times the mass times the speed squared. So remember, this is an equation that you have got to recall and you will not be given it in an exam. Outstanding progress is to rearrange the equation in order to calculate mass or velocity and state the factors that affect the kinetic energy store of objects. So to remember, kinetic energy is movement energy. Any object that is moving has kinetic energy. The equation that you need to remember is kinetic energy equals 1/2 times the mass times the speed squared. Pause the video and write down the equation. I've put in a yellow box there. Remember to square the speed because that can easily lose you a mark. The units for kinetic energy are joules. For mass, they are kilograms. So if any question has grams in it, you need to convert to kilograms. Speed is called velocity. So velocity is meters per second. The short version of the equation is EK, kinetic energy, equals 1/2 times the mass times the velocity squared. Now kinetic energy is affected by two factors, and that is mass and velocity. Let's have a go at a practice question. A car that travels at a speed of 20 meters per second and has a mass of 1,200 kilograms. Calculate the kinetic energy. So the first thing we need to do is to remember the equation. So kinetic energy equals 1/2 times the mass times the velocity squared. First thing we need to do is to substitute. Substitution is taking the figures from the question and putting them in the equation. This will always gain you a mark in the exam. So kinetic energy equals 1/2 times the mass 1,200 times the velocity 20 squared. Kinetic energy equals 0.5 times 1,200 times 400. Put all of that into your calculator and the kinetic energy is 240,000 joules. Remember to put the unit if it's not given to you. This is also worth a mark. Task 1, there are 4 questions where you need to calculate kinetic energy. Remember to use the equation kinetic energy equals 1/2 times the mass times the velocity squared. Pause the video, complete the 4 questions. On the next slide, you'll have the answers where you can red pen and green pen self-assess. Now we need to rearrange the equation. Questions could ask you to either calculate mass or velocity. So the first one we're going to look at is mass. So here I have mass. I need to find mass by itself. So therefore the 1/2 and the velocity squared need to go across the other side of the equal sign. Here they're multiplications. If I move them across to the other side, they become the inverse operation, which is a division. So mass equals the kinetic energy divided by 1/2 times velocity squared. On the other side, they may ask you to calculate velocity. This is a little bit more difficult. Again, I need to move 1/2 and mass to the other side of the equation. If they're the other side of the equal sign, they're the inverse operation. Here they're a multiplication, so if I move them, they become a division. So velocity equals the kinetic energy divided by 1/2 times the mass. But we have to be careful. We have velocity squared here. The question will ask you to calculate velocity only. So in order to calculate velocity, the inverse of a square is the square root. So we have to put the square root sign in. One tip here is that for any rearrangement of this equation, kinetic energy will always be on the top of the division. Task 2. Calculate velocity. Now we're going to use our rearranged equation to calculate the velocity in the next 5 questions. Pause the video, have a go at the questions. On the next slide will be the answers where you can self-assess in red and green pen. Task 3. Now we're going to calculate mass. There are 5 questions. Use your rearranged equation to calculate the mass. On the next slide, there are the answers where you can red pen and green pen self-assess. Task 4. This is your checking for understanding of the lesson. There are 6 questions. Questions 2 to 5 are asking you to calculate. Therefore, make sure that you rearrange your equation correctly, you substitute and you calculate. On the next slide are the 6 answers where you can self-assess in red and green pen.